If you've ever driven through the Tuscan countryside or seen one of those Hollywood movies that are set here, you'll know one of the most famous icons of this region are its many old hill towns. But what you might not know is just how ancient and how many hundreds of them there are, still thriving with hyper-localized cultures, but crucially, just how important they were during pivotal moments of human history. It's a story that's almost 3,000 years in the making, and in this episode, we're going to explore how it was that Tuscany's little hill towns helped determine the course of Western civilization. Without them, the Roman Empire, which gave civilization so much, may never have come into existence. And even more important to our modern world, the Renaissance, which first blossomed in Tuscany and tore Europe out of the Dark Ages, might never have been triggered. Hello good people, and welcome to one of the most fascinating stories of Italian history and culture that you've probably never heard of. Understanding the phenomenon of the Tuscan hill town and how they changed the world comes in exploring two pivotal eras of human history. First, the ancient civilization of the indigenous Tuscan people, and second, the intense competition which occurred after the fall of a great empire. The first clue comes from the name Tuscan itself, derived from the Etruscan civilization, which inhabited this region with almost exactly the same borders that it does today, only almost 3,000 years ago. Now, the Etruscans were a highly complex society, which predated the Roman Empire by almost a millennia, and even as the small city-state of Rome just to the south began to expand, the dominance of Etruscan culture is known by the fact that many of the first kings of Rome were actually of Etruscan origin. The Etruscans derived their power from the great hilltop settlements that they created, each one being like an island of civilization among a sea of an untamed world. So influential was the Etruscan form of city building that many of today's greatest Italian cities are known to have been founded by them. Most, predictably, are in central Italy, but other famous cities settled by the Etruscans are surprisingly far beyond Tuscany's traditional borders. And so, it's in this environment that Rome would initially be founded in the 8th century BC as a series of elevated settlements across its famous 7 hills. But if we were to be transported back in time to walk the streets of this early Rome, you honestly wouldn't be very impressed. You see, while the Romans were building mostly with wood and clay, their northern neighbours in Etruria had for centuries already been building with marble and stone. Quite a far cry from the glistening metropolis of Rome that we know today. In fact, the first city walls of Rome were built by the Etruscans around its central Capitoline Hill, and it would be exactly these defences that would save Rome from total annihilation. In 390 BC, the fledgling Roman army suffered a shock defeat to a barbarian tribe that had come pillaging down from Gaul in modern-day France. With no army left to defend the city, a small number of its inhabitants retreated to the great Etruscan walls of the Capitoline Hill, hoping to wait out the storm as the city burned around them. The scale of the destruction is known by some accounts, which tell us that almost all of Rome's senators were butchered by the invaders. Pretty dire, and to think, without those Etruscan walls, we may never have heard of Rome. North Africa, the Middle East, and most of Europe would never have been unified under the most sophisticated civilization the world had ever seen. And whilst we all know that Rome wasn't built in a day, we can also say that in many important ways it wasn't even built by the Romans at all, but rather by the Etruscans. The other crucial part of understanding this story is grappling with how it was that these Etruscan towns became so sophisticated to begin with. But of course, this plays into the main consequence of having so many successful hilltop towns rubbing shoulders, the very predictable human reaction of competition. This key ingredient spurred a sense of innovation and internationalism, which saw the Etruscans draw upon the very best of the civilized world as they knew it. In fact, taking a wider look at the world that they found themselves in, we can see just how sparsely spread out across the Mediterranean these complex societies were before the rise of Rome. And actually, we can see Rome's very fortunate position of being nestled up against the Etruscans meant that they were able to soak up much of this cultural enrichment to make history-changing innovations in the military, engineering, and political organization. And this culminated in giving the Romans both the means and the motivation to see themselves as masters of the known world. But This competitive culture would also be the eventual downfall of their Etruscan founding fathers, as it would never allow the competing hilltops to coherently unify against the growing power of Rome. It would take the collective might of the rest of Italy, now brought under Roman rule, to truly unify the Etruscan cities at the end of a Roman sword. But as it turned out, during the Romans' rise to dominance, their tastes in city building had changed. A small detail, you might think, but this was a deviation from their earlier Etruscan recipe for success that would eventually spell doom for the whole Roman Empire. And so, we fast forward almost 700 years later to the second era, which we're discovering today, to the dying days of the empire, where a very interesting event took place in northwest Tuscany. Just 4 years before Rome itself would eventually be overrun and sacked by barbarians in the year 410 AD, the Romans managed to achieve one of their last great victories against the invading Germanic hordes. This was not, however, achieved at the walls of the local Roman-built city by the name of Florence, but instead by using to their advantage the high terrain of the nearby Etruscan-built hill town named Fiesole. Something absolutely fundamental had changed. Florence was established by the Romans in the open plains of this area by the famous Julius Caesar in 59 BC, while Fiesole was founded as an Etruscan city on the main hill overlooking it around 800 years earlier. By the time Julius Caesar arrived, though, Fiesole had begun to be overlooked by the Romans as a more primitive form of living. The accessibility of Florence in the valley below allowed commerce, culture, and personal aspiration to flourish during the next 400 years of relatively stable Roman peace. The problem was that, as the pragmatists that they were, the Romans had made several compromises in the construction of their cities in order to improve the flow of commerce and military supplies around the empire. But by the time of the 5th century AD, the frontiers of the Roman Empire had begun to collapse. The Roman army was by this point a shadow of its former self, worn down by endless civil wars and corruption. Invading barbarian tribes were no longer being challenged, and so they could easily disrupt this essential flow of supplies upon which Roman civilization was built. And just like the Gallic sack of Rome in 390 BC all those centuries before, the Romans once again retreated behind their Etruscan walls in the hills as their city burned around them. They do say that history always repeats itself. Now, the success of the old Etruscan elevated cities like Fiesole during the Dark Ages prompted hundreds of copycat settlements across other hilltops throughout Tuscany. It wasn't until many turbulent centuries had passed, when the invaders eventually transitioned into being settlers within what remained of the old Roman cities, that Florence began to recover to the detriment of Fiesole once again. Yet such was the power of Fiesole that it wasn't until the 12th century AD that the now rival Florentines finally managed to conquer her, despite now dwarfing it in size. The rivalry ran so deep, in fact, that the famous Florentine poet Dante referred to them as the beasts of Fiesole. But what Dante perhaps didn't appreciate is the fact that this highly competitive environment between the city-states of Tuscany created battles as much of prestige as of conventional warfare. And just like the Etruscans millennia before, this spurred the development of cities that were not only functional, but that were also extraordinarily beautiful too. And it's in part due to this reason why even today many a small chapel found in these tiny hilltop settlements possess world-renowned works of art. Their fierce sense of independence from one another draws both from their Etruscan past and still fuels today's culture of hyper-localized pride. And so, it's not too much of a stretch to now understand how the Renaissance, which would change the world forever, was first sparked in little old Tuscany. Through living among the remnants of an ancient and majestic past, and while engaging in cultural wars of prestige amongst their neighbours, almost 1,000 years of the Dark Ages would eventually be extinguished. A renewed focus on art, philosophy, engineering, and political organization finally allowed Western civilization to pick up from where the Romans had left off. And so guys, that's the end of the story. Now this was a huge experiment for me, and I really hope that your feedback can encourage me to continue telling these stories of unknown parts of Italian history and culture. If you're into that, a like is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe so you can find me again. Until the next time, arrivederci.